Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we are strapping in for what you might call a genuine intellectual battle royal.
That sounds about right.
We're going back, way back to the first few centuries of Islamic history. And this wasn't a time of, quiet agreement. It was the opposite. Radical, intense, ideological conflict.
Absolutely. A pressure cooker of ideas.
So this deep dive, it focuses on the forces, both inside and outside the early Muslim community, that basically forced the creation of systematic theology itself.
It was like a forced evolution, you could say, a profound struggle where this nascent Muslim intellectual world slammed right into Greek philosophy, Indian skepticism, Persian dualism, all of it, head on.
So our goal today, what are we aiming for?
Well, what the source material really shows us, quite vividly actually, is that the Muslim community was immediately hit with intellectual challenges, unlike anything they'd seen before. They had no choice, really. They had to develop systematic theology.
Which they called kalam.
Exactly, kalam, or dialectical theology.
Yeah.
It was a tool for survival in this onslaught of ideas. So our mission today is to trace this intellectual lineage. We want to see exactly who challenged them from the outside.
Like the dualists and skeptics.
Right. And who thought internally, the different Muslim factions. And how this immense pressure cooker forced the synthesis that eventually became what we know as Islamic orthodoxy.
It's kind of a shortcut, isn't it, to understanding the intellectual foundations that, frankly, still resonate today.
It really is. And crucially, this story doesn't start in a quiet library or some philosopher's study.
No, it kicks off right in the political arena, because theology, well, it nearly always follows the flag, doesn't it?
Precisely. You can't grasp the creedal splits without understanding the split in leadership first. It really starts with the political turmoil after the murder of Uthman, the third caliph.
A huge event.
Massive. It caused this deep political crisis that basically fractured the community. You had those supporting Muawiyah, the governor of Syria, and those backing Ali, the fourth caliph.
And the breaking point, the real crisis, was the civil war itself. Muslims fighting Muslims. Siffin.
Yes. And that created this existential theological dilemma. It was highly charged. Who was right? Who was wrong? What happens to a Muslim who kills another Muslim? What does that mean for their eternal fate?
It wasn't abstract. This forced immediate, very hot debates among scholars. Debates that, like you said, still echo today about the nature of faith, sin, and community.
And right out of that political chaos, the first major theological division was born, the Khawarij, the secessionists.
They walked out.
Literally. They emerged specifically during the Battle of Siffin and the arbitration crisis that followed between Ali and Muawiyah. Their name, Khawarij, means to depart or withdraw. They saw the political compromise, the arbitration, as a profound sin, a betrayal of God's law.
And they weren't messing around. The sources paint them as incredibly puritanical, totally uncompromising, intolerant of any kind of civil refinements or gray areas.
That's putting it mildly. Their defining theological stance, the one that shook everything up, was declaring that anyone who committed a major sin was instantly a disbeliever, a kafir.
Oh, okay. Unpack that. A major sin instantly makes you an unbeliever.
Instantly. And their definition of major sin could be quite broad. It wasn't just murder or apostasy. It could include political compromise, like Ali agreeing to arbitration, or even things that seem minor to us, like maybe wearing silk. If you committed one of these, in their eyes, boom, you were outside Islam, cast out.
So the implication wasn't just theological, was it? It was deadly serious. If you declare someone a kafir, you justify. Well, the source calls it sheer terrorism, especially groups like the Iraqis, one sect of the Khawarij.
Absolutely. They felt justified in killing other Muslims who didn't meet their standard, often with a terrifying sense of self-righteousness. This wasn't just arguing about doctrine in a classroom. It was life and death based on theological interpretation.
What was their reasoning? How did they get there?
It was radical. They basically believed that reading Revelation, the Quran, was always filtered through the flawed human mind, distorted, refracted. So any failure to adhere to their absolute literal standard meant you'd clearly departed from God's true, unadulterated will.
Zero tolerance for interpretation or human failing.
Pretty much. They demanded this literal, uncompromising adherence to Scripture, which led directly to this extreme political and theological intolerance.
Mm-hmm.
Their very existence forced the rest of the Muslim community to grapple with the question, what are the limits of sin? Can a believer sin greatly and still be a believer?
Which naturally brings us to the counterreaction, the murjia, the deferrers.
Exactly. They were a direct response to the Khawarij's severity on sin. If the Qawari said a major sinner is instantly damned and outside Islam.
The Murji'a said, hold on, let's defer judgment. That's the irja part, right? Deferral.
Precisely. Irja. Their core ideology was a necessary counterbalance. They argued that a Muslim who commits even a grave sin is still fundamentally a Muslim, maybe a deficient one, but a Muslim nonetheless. And only God can judge their ultimate fate in the hereafter. So they drew a line between faith and deeds.
In essence, yes. They argued that faith, iman, and actions, amal, were distinct. As long as the core belief in God and his prophet was intact, judgment on the actions was deferred to God.
Okay, so the practical effect of irja was what? More stability.
Definitely more stability. It promoted a kind of theological tolerance, which was politically very useful. It allowed people to tolerate, say, the Umayyad rulers, who were often accused of being impious or worldly by their opponents.
Without declaring them kafir.
Right. And perhaps even more importantly, it helped integrate the massive numbers of non-Arabs who were converting to Islam. It offered a more accommodating, less judgmental entry point into the community.
But it wasn't the mainstream view, was it? Theologically, it came at a cost. It did depart significantly from what became the traditional majority view. The traditional view held that, yes, major sinners would face punishment in hell, even if God might eventually forgive them and admit them to paradise. The Murji'a, especially in their more extreme forms, seemed to downplay the importance of good works.
Risking a kind of moral complacency, if belief is all that really matters.
That was the danger, yes. It risked undermining the incentive for righteous behavior. So you see how this initial political crisis over leadership immediately cascaded into these fundamental theological questions. What is faith? What is sin? What makes someone a Muslim? It laid the groundwork for everything that followed.
Okay, so while these internal splits, the Qawari and Murji'a, were taking shape.
Right, fueled by politics.
The growing Muslim empire was also bumping up against ancient, really sophisticated philosophical systems from outside the fold, non-Muslim ideas.
Absolutely. Persia, India, the Hellenistic world, they weren't intellectually empty spaces, and encountering these systems forced a whole new level of definition for core Islamic doctrines, especially Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God and the nature of God and creation itself.
So what was the first major external challenge? The sources mention dualism.
Yes, the Thanawiyya. These are the dualists. The most famous examples would be Zoroastrians or perhaps Manichaeans. Their core belief was in two co-eternal creators or principles.
One good, one evil. Light and darkness.
Exactly. One for good and light, like Ahura Mazda in Zoroastrianism, and one for evil and darkness, like Ahriman. This was a fundamental, direct challenge to the Islamic concept of Tawhid, the absolute unity and sovereignty of God.
Because if there are two creators, God isn't one.
Precisely. So Muslim theologians had to clarify very carefully how God can be the sole creator of everything, including things we perceive as evil or chaotic, without attributing any imperfection or evil to God himself. It's a tricky theological knot.
And this wasn't just a philosophical game, was it? It was Apologetics 101. How do you defend God's absolute unity and power against these complex systems that seem to offer an easier explanation for evil?
It was critical. And this challenge quickly spun into that age-old debate, free will versus determinism. The dualists kind of poked the bear here, because if God is the sole creator of everything, including evil actions, well, how is God just? How are humans responsible?
Right. So on one side of that spectrum, you had the Qadariya, the advocates for free will.
Yes. They strongly opposed fatalism, which was known as al-Jab. The Qadariya believed that humans possess genuine volition, free will, and they actually create their own actions, both good and evil.
Making them fully responsible.
Fully responsible. They framed it almost as an early scientific discussion, trying to reject social laziness or people just saying, oh, well, it's all fate. They wanted to emphasize human agency. Interestingly, some sources suggest they were influenced by the dualists.
Yeah.
Well, in trying to protect God's absolute justice, Adil, some Qadariya might have leaned toward saying that evil actions, like sin, weren't directly willed or created by God, but originated either from Satan's influence or from man's own independent power to create actions. It was a radical attempt to shield God from any association with evil.
And then you had the complete opposite end, the Druriya, the fatalists.
The extreme determinists, often associated with a figure named Jam ibn Safwan. They claimed humans have absolutely no choice at all. We are, in their famous analogy, like a feather in the wind.
Totally passive.
Utterly passive. Their doctrine was the absolute antithesis of the Qadariya. They argued that all human actions are entirely predetermined and directly created by God. Humans merely acquire the action, but God is the true creator.
That sounds problematic. What were the implications?
Profound. This absolute determinism led some, like John's followers, known as the Jamia, towards a kind of pantheism. If God creates everything, including our thoughts and actions, and is the only real actor, well, some concluded that God is everything. It risked dissolving the fundamental distinction between the creator and the creation.
Wow. It's fascinating how quickly these debates force people to define not just what God is, but maybe more importantly, what God isn't.
Exactly. Defining the boundaries was crucial. But perhaps the most radical challenges, the ones that feel eerily modern, came from groups entirely outside the Abrahamic framework, the skeptics and the materialists.
Okay, let's dig into this. The skeptics first. The Samanea or Berhima, where did they come from?
Mostly from the East, as the empire expanded into regions with strong Indian philosophical traditions. Think Buddhists, Jains, maybe Ajivikas. These weren't necessarily atheists, but they were deeply skeptical traditions focused on human achievement, empirical knowledge, and a critical non-acceptance of claims that couldn't be verified.
So what was their specific challenge to Islam?
They questioned the very necessity of prophecy and revelation itself. Their argument was basically, if truth can be known through our senses, or through pure reason, why do we even need a messenger from God? Why rely on transmitted reports, like Scripture, when we have direct experience and logic?
They wanted empirical proof for everything.
Pretty much. Their skepticism was often aimed at denying the religious merit people claimed from virtuous acts, if those acts were based solely on blind faith in revelation. They demanded proof for prophecy, for the afterlife, for things beyond immediate sensory data or logical deduction. It was a fundamental challenge to the epistemology of religion.
And then the Daria, the existential materialists. You said this is where it gets really interesting for modern parallels.
Oh, absolutely. If you want to find ancient precursors to modern scientific atheism, this is the group. The Daria were a distinct, pretty strict type of atheist or materialist sect.
Okay, what did they believe?
They flat out denied prophecy. No messengers needed, because there's no God sending them. They believe in the eternity of time. Dar means time or fate. So, the universe wasn't created, it has always existed.
No beginning, no creator.
Exactly. And how did things come to be? Not divine creation, but through self-generation or evolution. The source explicitly frames this as evolution as used by atheists to refute creationism.
Wait, you're telling me that in the 8th or 9th century, Muslim theologians were systematically debating concepts like self-generation and evolution being used to argue against creationism. That sounds like a debate happening now.
It is astonishingly familiar, isn't it? Their doctrine was strict materialism. All that exists is matter and time, perpetually existing and changing. They completely rejected the religious framework, the metaphysics of it all.
So they were basically scientific reductionists living within a society that was overwhelmingly religious, but they rejected its core premises based on materialist arguments.
That's a perfect description. They are the clearest historical link in this context to modern scientific reductionism, materialism, and even determinism, since eternal matter follows its own inherent laws. Their challenge was incredibly sophisticated. These weren't just simple idol worshippers. They were using logical arguments against the contingency of the universe, the idea that the universe depends on something else for its existence.
So they couldn't be ignored. They had to be answered logically.
Precisely. They forced the development of a systematic, rational defense of Islam, and that defense became known as Kalam, and its earliest, most robust champions against these specific threats were the Mu'tazila. To counter the Daria, for instance, theologians had to develop really sophisticated proofs for the contingency of the universe, arguing that the world must have a beginning and therefore a creator, because nothing can logically bring itself into existence from nothing. The debates were intense.
Okay, so enter the Mu'tazila, the rationalists. They sound like the intellectual heavyweights who stepped up to meet these challenges.
They absolutely were. They were the grand synthesizers of their time. They took the tools of Greek logic, particularly Neoplatonism and Aristotelian metaphysics, and they wielded them not to abandon Islam, but to build this systematic logical fortress to defend it against all comers. The dualists, the skeptics, the materialist Daria, other internal heretics, Sinaitica, everyone.
The source material even suggests their intellectual challenge to the early Muslim community was in some ways maybe even greater than the challenge Catholicism later presented to Europe.
That's a strong claim, but it highlights their intellectual power. They weren't just reacting. They were proactively defining Islam through rigorous logic, built around what became known as their 5 principles, or Usul al-Khamsa.
Right, let's quickly define those because they really dictated the Mu'tazilite worldview. Principle 1, Tawhid,
Oh.
unity.
The absolute bedrock. They were so fiercely committed to God's absolute oneness and uniqueness that they went to great lengths to strip God of any descriptive attributes, sifat, that might even imply multiplicity or anthropomorphism or compromises that are transcendence.
And this had immediate controversial consequences, didn't it? Like their view on the Quran.
Huge consequences. It led directly to their famous and highly contested view that the Quran was not the uncreated eternal word of God. Their logic was, if the Quran, as God's speech, were also eternal and uncreated, then you have two eternal entities, God and his speech. That compromises Tawhid.
So it had to be created.
For them, logically, yes. The Quran had to be created in time, like the rest of the universe, to preserve God's absolute unique eternality. This became a major point of conflict.
Okay, principle 2, a lull justice.
This was their key response to the fatalists, the Jabriya. They insisted that God is absolutely just, and his actions must conform to principles of justice that human reason can understand. If God commands something, yes, it's good because he commanded it, but more fundamentally, he commands it because it is inherently good and just, and our reason can perceive that inherent goodness.
So reason becomes the arbiter of divine justice.
In a sense, yes, and this defense of God's justice absolutely required them to adopt the Qadariya position on free will. Humans must create their own actions.
Why must?
Because if God created evil actions, like sin, and then punished human beings for those actions, God himself would be unjust, according to their rational standard. Therefore, to protect God's justice, man must have complete free will and be the author of his own deeds.
Makes sense within their framework. Principle 3, the promise and the threat. Al-Wad was al-Wa'id.
Right. This meant God is absolutely bound by his promises of reward for the obedient and his threats of punishment for the disobedient. No wiggle room.
This sounds like a direct shot at the Murji'a.
It was. The Murji'a deferred judgment, suggesting God might forgive major sinners. The Mu'tazila said no. God, being perfectly just and true to his word, cannot fail to punish a major sinner who dies unrepentant, nor can he fail to reward a true believer. His threats and promises are absolute.
Which led to their fourth principle, the intermediate position, al-manzila baina al-manzilatain. This is where their name came from, right? Mu'tazila, those who withdraw or stand apart.
Exactly. This was their solution to the Qawari-Murji'a debate about the major sinner. They argued, a Muslim who commits a major sin and doesn't repent is not a full believer, like the Murji'a might imply, but also not a complete disbeliever, kafir, like the Qawaris declared.
So, what are they?
They are in an intermediate state, a fasik, a grave sinner. They are still technically part of the Muslim community in this world, but if they die in that state, they are destined for eternal punishment in hell. They withdrew from both extreme positions.
And the final principle, commanding the good and forbidding the evil, al-amr bi al-maruf wa al-nahy an munkar.
This wasn't just a personal moral duty for them, it was a mandate for social and political action. They believed the community, and particularly its scholars and leaders, had a duty to actively uphold moral order, speak out against injustice, and even some interpretations rise up against tyrannical rulers who violated these core principles.
So, this combination of extreme rationalism and political activism, it sounds like a recipe for conflict.
It absolutely was. And it led directly to one of the most traumatic episodes in early Islamic intellectual history, the Mina, the Inquisition.
An actual inquisition.
Yes. Under the Abbasid Caliph al-Ma'mun, who was a strong supporter of Mu'tazilite ideas, the doctrine of the createdness of the Quran was imposed as state orthodoxy. From about 833 CE onwards, for roughly 15 years.
Imposed how?
Through coercion. Scholars, judges, officials were summoned and forced to publicly affirm that the Quran was created. Refusal could mean losing your job, imprisonment, flogging, even death threats. It wasn't just a debate anymore. The state was using its power to enforce a specific theological doctrine derived from rationalism.
A genuine crisis of conscience and power. The whole intellectual project was suddenly backed by state force.
Exactly. But this persecution created its own resistance, and the undisputed figurehead of that resistance became Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal.
The founder of the Hanbali school of law.
Indeed. He became the symbol, the vanguard of the traditional conservative theological approach of the earliest Muslims, the Salaf. His position was profoundly simple, yet unshakable.
What was his stance during the Mina?
He refused to play the rationalist game. When pressed on whether the Quran was created or uncreated, he simply refused to engage in that kind of speculation. He affirmed it was the speech of God, Kalam Allah, and stopped there. He wouldn't affirm it was created, like the Mu'tazila, nor would he delve into arguments about its uncreated nature in the way later theologians might. He famously suffered imprisonment and flogging for his refusal to compromise tradition for what he saw as dangerous rational innovation. Bid'ah.
His legacy was therefore immense, wasn't it? He stood firm.
Absolutely. He provided the bedrock for the orthodox schools that came later, specifically the approach that rejected speculative interpretation, Tawil, regarding God's attributes mentioned in the texts. His method became known as tafwid, often summarized as affirming the attributes bila kayf without asking how, except what the scripture says about God, like his hand or his istiwa ascension. But don't use human reason to speculate on the manner or modality of those attributes. Just affirm the reality as God described it, consigning the how to God's knowledge.
He stood firm against the rationalists and the caliph's power. But you mentioned another danger emerging.
Yes, and this is a crucial nuance that often gets missed. Hannibal's stance was one of pious reticence, avoiding speculation. But the vacuum created by his non-committal approach, combined with the reaction against the Mu'tazila's denial of attributes, unfortunately attracted another extreme group, the Hashawaya.
Who were they?
These were essentially crypto-anthropomorphists, extreme literalists. They latched on to Hannibal's popularity and his defense of tradition, but they twisted his position. Where Hannibal practiced tafwid, consigning the how to God, the Hashaway took the literal texts about God's hand, eyes, face, sitting on the throne, and interpreted them in a crudely physical anthropomorphic way.
So they were saying God literally has a body like humans.
That was the implication of their crude literalism, yes. They tried to ingratiate themselves with Hannibal's followers, claiming they were the true defenders of the Sunnah against the Mu'tazila. But Hannibal himself was vehemently opposed to this kind of anthropomorphism, tashbih. He affirmed the attributes bila kayf, not with a physicalist interpretation.
So it was a confusing, dangerous time. You had the extreme rationalists on one side, denying attributes or explaining them away allegorically, and these extreme literalists on the other, affirming them in a physical sense.
Exactly. The community desperately needed a middle path, a way to uphold tradition and affirm the texts, without falling into the trap of comparing God to his creation, but also without resorting to the radical negations of the Mu'tazila. They needed a skilled navigator to chart that course, using logic and respecting tradition.
And that navigator, the one who really forged that middle path, was Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, a pivotal figure.
Absolutely pivotal. And his story is fascinating because he started out as a top-tier Mu'tazilite scholar himself. He studied under al-Jubai, one of the leading Mu'tazilite thinkers of the time. His dramatic break from them signaled the real beginning of the dominant mainstream Orthodox theological response.
What caused the break? The sources mention a famous dispute, the case of the three brothers.
That's the traditional account, yes, and it perfectly illustrates the breaking point, the perceived limits of Mu'tazilite rationalism when dealing with divine justice and wisdom. The story goes that al-Ash'ari posed a hypothetical case to his teacher, al-Jubai.
Okay, what was the case?
Imagine three brothers. One dies as a pious true believer, one dies as a disbeliever, and the third dies as a child before reaching the age of accountability. Al-Ash'ari asked his teacher, what are their fates in the hereafter?
Okay. The believer goes to heaven, the disbeliever to hell, presumably. What about the child?
Exactly. Al-Jubai, sticking to Mu'tazilite principles, supposedly said the believer is in the highest ranks of paradise, the disbeliever is in hell, and the child is in a state of safety, but not the high ranks of paradise because the child hadn't earned that through good deeds. Remember, Adil God only rewards earned merit.
Okay. Seems logical within their system, but Ash'ari pushed back.
He did. He asked, what if the child complains to God, saying, "Oh Lord, why did you let me die young? If you had let me live, I might have become a believer and earned those high ranks like my brother."
Good question. How does the rationalist system handle that if God is bound by human concepts of fairness?
Precisely. According to the story, al-Jubai replied that God would say, "I knew that if you had lived, you would have become a disbeliever, so I mercifully let you die young to spare you from hell."
Okay.
But then al-Ash'ari delivered the killer blow. Then what if the disbeliever brother cries out from hell, "Oh Lord, you knew my fate too. Why didn't you let me die young like my infant brother, sparing me this torment?"
Oof. Checkmate.
Exactly. According to the narrative, al-Jubai was stumped. There was no answer consistent with the Mu'tazilite insistence that God's actions must align perfectly with human conceptions of justice and rationality. This exchange, or something like it, reportedly convinced al-Ash'ari that pure human reason had its limits in comprehending the divine will and wisdom, It prompted his public break from the Mu'tazila and his return to what he saw as the balanced traditional path.
But crucially, he didn't just reject logic or reason, did he? That's the key to the Ash'ari school's success.
Absolutely not. That's the genius of it. Al-Ash'ari and his followers adopted and adapted the very tools honed by the Mu'tazila: sophisticated rhetoric, dialectical argument, kalam, even Aristotelian logical categories. But they used these tools to defend the traditional beliefs of the al-Sunnah wal-Jama'ah, the people of the Sunnah and the community.
So what did the Ash'ari synthesis look like? Where did they land on the key issues?
They became the great reconcilers, the middle ground. Their mission was to strike a balance. On divine attributes, they firmly rejected the Mu'tazilite tendency to negate them or explain them away allegorically. They affirmed the attributes mentioned in the Quran and Sunnah: God's hand, eyes, face, istiwa.
But not literally like the Hashawaya.
Definitely not. They vehemently rejected the literalistic anthropomorphism, tashbih of the Hashawaya. They affirmed the attributes bila kayf without saying how, essentially adopting Imam Ahmad's cautious approach, but systematizing it theologically. They affirm the reality of the attributes while acknowledging that their modality is beyond human comprehension.
What about other key issues like seeing God?
They affirmed the possibility of the beatific vision, seeing God in the hereafter, which the Mu'tazila denied based on rational arguments about vision requiring physicality and direction. The Ash'aris accepted the scriptural texts on this and affirmed it, again, bila kayf. On free will, they developed a nuanced position called kasba, acquisition, trying to balance divine omnipotence and human responsibility, a complex topic in itself.
And this synthesis was incredibly influential.
Hugely. The Ash'ari school became dominant, especially in the western parts of the Islamic world, North Africa, Egypt, the Levant, the Hijaz, and spread widely through scholars aligned with the Shafi'i and Maliki schools of law. It provided the intellectual framework for mainstream Sunni Islam for centuries.
But it wasn't the only orthodox school of kalam to emerge, was it? There was a parallel development in Central Asia.
That's right. Almost contemporaneously with al-Ash'ari, another towering figure was developing a very similar, yet distinct, orthodox theological system in Samarkand in Transoxiana. This was Abu Mansur al-Maturidi.
And his school, the Maturidi school, also became very widespread.
Yes, particularly in the East. It became closely associated with the Hanafi school of law, which was dominant in Central Asia, Anatolia, modern Turkey, the Balkans, and the Indian subcontinent. So the Maturidi school became the predominant theological framework for Hanafis across vast regions.
Now, both Ash'ari and Maturidi are considered the twin pillars of orthodox Sunni kalam. They agree on most fundamentals, but there's a subtle yet really important difference in emphasis, particularly regarding reason and revelation. Can you clarify that for us?
Yes, this distinction is crucial, especially for understanding concepts like religious obligation. While both schools represent the orthodox synthesis balancing reason and tradition, al-Maturidi generally places a slightly greater emphasis on the capacity of human reason compared to al-Ash'ari, particularly in knowing God and basic morality before revelation arrives.
Okay, how does that play out?
Maturidi argued that human reason, unaided by revelation, can know certain fundamental truths, that the universe has a creator, that God exists, and even some basic moral obligations, like knowing gratitude is good and justice is bad.
So even someone who never received a message from a prophet, Maturidi says they could figure out God exists just by using their intellect.
Yes, and crucially, because they could know this through reason, Maturidi held that such a person is morally responsible and potentially culpable before God if they fail to acknowledge him or adhere to basic rational morality, even without receiving a scripture or a prophet. Reason itself establishes a basic level of obligation.
Wow. What did Ash'ari say about that?
Ash'ari took a different view. While acknowledging reason's role in understanding and confirming faith, he maintained that revelation is absolutely necessary to establish any religious or moral obligation. Taklif. Reason alone cannot make something obligatory in God's eyes.
So for Ash'ari, that person on a remote island who never heard of a prophet
Is generally considered excused.
Mother.
They are not held morally culpable by God for failing to believe or perform religious duties because obligation, for Ash'ari, is established only through God's revealed command via scripture and prophets. Without revelation, there is no specific divine obligation.
That's a fascinating difference. Both orthodox, both balancing reason and revelation, but with a different calibration on reason's independent power to establish obligation.
Exactly. So by the 10th, 11th centuries, you have the three main strands of Orthodox Sunni theology solidifying.
1. Imam Ahmad Ibn Hanbal's approach traditionalist, non-committal on speculation, emphasizing tafwid and bila kayf, generally suspicious of kalam.
2. Imam al-Ash'ari's school, the balanced synthesis using kalam to defend tradition, affirming attributes bila kayf, emphasizing revelation as primary for obligation, dominant among Shafis and Malikists.
And 3, Imam al-Maturidi's school, a similar balanced synthesis, also using kalam, perhaps with a slightly greater scope given to reason's ability to know God and basic morality, independently dominant among Hanafis.
That's the essential landscape that emerged from those centuries of intense debate.
Okay, so the orthodox schools, Ash'ari and Maturidi, had established this powerful synthesis. But the rationalist movement, the legacy of the Mu'tazila and the philosophers influenced by them, didn't just evaporate overnight, did it?
Not at all. Their methods, their reliance on Greek logic and philosophical argument, remained highly influential, especially among intellectuals and those engaged in scientific pursuits. This created an environment where philosophical challenges, particularly from those deeply steeped in Aristotelian and Neoplatonic thought, the Falasifa, continued to simmer.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the intervention of probably the most famous figure in this whole story outside of the Imams themselves, al-Ghazali.
Imam Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, a towering figure, himself a brilliant scholar following the Ash'ari school. He was, in many ways, tasked by the political and religious establishment of his time, the Seljuk Sultanate, with providing a decisive intellectual refutation of the lingering influence of the philosophers and other perceived heresies.
And his strategy was just brilliant, wasn't it? He didn't just condemn philosophy, he mastered it to defeat it on its own terms.
Exactly. His most famous work in this regard is Tahafut al-Falasifa, often translated as The Incoherence of the Philosophers. In it, he meticulously dissects the core metaphysical doctrines of the Muslim philosophers, particularly figures like Avicenna, Ibn Sina, and al-Farabi, who were heavily influenced by Greek thought. He aimed to show that their reliance on pure reason, when applied to metaphysics beyond the empirical realm, led to logical contradictions and conclusions incompatible with revealed religion.
What was one of his key lines of attack?
One of the most devastating was his critique of their doctrine of necessary causality. The philosophers, following Aristotle, largely believed in natural laws operating with inherent necessity. For example, fire necessarily burns cotton because of an intrinsic property within fire itself. Cause inevitably produces its effect.
Okay, that sounds like basic science. What was Ghazali's issue with it?
Ghazali argued quite radically for his time that what we observe is merely a constant conjunction, not a necessary connection. We see fire touch cotton, and then we see the cotton burn. But we don't actually observe any invisible power of necessity making the fire burn the cotton.
So correlation doesn't equal causation.
Precisely. He argued that it is God who wills the burning to occur at the moment of contact between the fire and the cotton. Fire doesn't burn by its own nature. It burns because God continuously creates the effect of burning whenever the appropriate conditions he has set are met.
Why was this distinction so important theologically?
Because, for Ghazali, accepting necessary causality fundamentally limits God's power and sovereignty. It suggests that God set up these natural laws and is now somehow bound by them. Ghazali wanted to reaffirm God's absolute continuous power over every single event in creation at every single moment. This also crucially made miracles logically possible. God could simply will not to create the burning effect when fire touches something.
By showing the internal contradictions and the unreliable nature of pure philosophical speculation in metaphysics, he effectively argued for prioritizing revelation over unaided reason when it came to ultimate truths about God and reality. He used logic to show the limits of logic.
It was a masterful move. He logically undermined the certainty that the philosophers claimed for their metaphysical systems, thereby delivering a powerful intellectual defense of the orthodox position.
Now, let's really frame the context here, using that battle royal idea, because the intellectual scene al-Ghazali entered was incredibly dynamic.
Absolutely. You had this period, centuries really, of intense debate. It was like an arena of ideas: Khawarij, Murjiya, Qadariya, Jabriya, dualists, skeptics, Dariya, Mu'tazila, all digging it out theologically and philosophically.
And by Ghazali's time, the Mu'tazilites and the rationalist philosophers, Falasifa, had, in a way, knocked out or marginalized many of the earlier, perhaps less sophisticated opposition groups. They represented the peak of rational inquiry.
Yes, but, crucially, they weren't just abstract Greek rationalists sitting around contemplating the forms like Plato or syllogisms like Aristotle. Their rationalism was deeply intertwined with and buoyed by the incredibly vibrant scientific tradition that had flourished in the Islamic world.
You're talking about the Golden Age scientists.
Exactly. thinkers who are still famous names in Western culture today. Al-Haytham, revolutionized optics. Al-Biruni made incredible advances in astronomy, mathematics, geodesy, and of course Avicenna, Ibn Sina, a giant in both philosophy and medicine.
And these figures, many of them, adopted Greek rationalism as their kind of intellectual operating system, their lingua franca.
They did, but they didn't just copy it. They critically engaged with it, and they particularly focused on, refined, and massively developed the aspect most crucial for their scientific work.
Empiricism. Observation, experimentation, mathematical modeling. Al-Haytham's work on vision is a prime example of the scientific method in action. So the rationalism Al-Ghazali was confronting wasn't just abstract metaphysics. It was linked to this powerful, world-leading scientific movement grounded in empirical observation.
Precisely. They had reached a stage of combined rational and empirical thought that was, frankly, centuries ahead of Europe at the time. It was so advanced, so close in spirit to what Europe would later experience during its Renaissance and Enlightenment.
That it's no surprise their works were translated and studied so intensely in Europe, right?
Absolutely no surprise. Figures like Avicenna and Averroes, Ibn Rushd, along with the scientific texts, were hugely influential. Their textbooks on medicine, mathematics, astronomy, philosophy were standard reading in European universities for centuries. Avicenna's canon of medicine was used well into the 17th century, maybe even the 18th in some places. They directly helped spark that period of Western intellectual development.
So let's be clear, the Muslim world within its first 3 to 4 centuries had reached this incredibly advanced, almost modern stage of rational and empirical thought, embodied by these famous polymaths.
Yes, a powerful synthesis of Greek logic and practical empirical science.
And it was this very advanced stage of thought that Al-Ghazali, representing the Ash'ari Orthodox synthesis, then logically challenged and, in the theological realm at least, superseded relatively quickly through works like the Tahafut.
That's the crux of it. His critique wasn't aimed at empirical science itself. Ghazali valued knowledge, but at the metaphysical certainty claimed by the philosophers based on that rational empirical framework, especially when it conflicted with revelation.
Which leads to a really provocative question, doesn't it? What kind of ideology, what stage of thought could deliver such a decisive logical critique to a system so advanced and so intertwined with scientific progress? What was the nature of the worldview that Ghazali championed, which managed to achieve this intellectual ascendancy?
And that, exploring the deeper implications of Ghazali's intervention and the nature of the worldview that prevailed. Well, that's a perfect topic for our next discussion. #outro. Okay, so let's just quickly recap this incredibly dense but fascinating journey for you. We started with the political crisis after Uthman's death, which sparked the first internal theological splits, the harsh Khawarij versus the tolerant Murji'a.
Then these internal debates got way more sophisticated when the community slammed into external challenges. Persian dualists questioning God's unity, Indian skeptics questioning prophecy itself, and incredibly, the Duriya materialists arguing for an eternal universe and evolution, mirroring modern atheistic arguments.
Right. This intense competition forced the development of systematic theology, Kalam. It reached an early peak with the highly rationalist Mu'tazila, who tried to make Islamic doctrine conform strictly to human reason and concepts of justice.
But their rationalism led to the Mina crisis and was ultimately checked by traditionalists like Imam Ahmad. The lasting solution came from the Orthodox schools, primarily Ash'ari and Maturidi. They brilliantly used the tools of reason and kalam developed by the Mu'tazila, but used them to defend and synthesize traditional beliefs, affirming God's attributes bila kaif, balancing divine power and human responsibility, and crucially,
reconciling reason and revelation without letting reason override revelation on core metaphysical truths. This synthesis was powerfully cemented by Al-Ghazali's masterful critique of philosophical certainty, particularly his refutation of necessary causality in the incoherence of the philosophers. He didn't destroy reason, but he established revelation's primacy in knowing God.
This whole intellectual journey really defined the theological landscape of Sunni Islam for the next 1,000 years. But here's a final provocative thought for you to chew on, drawn straight from reflecting on these sources. Despite the intellectual triumph of Islamic orthodoxy over these rationalist and materialist philosophies more than a millennium ago, think about today, the core ideas of the materialists, the Duriya, an eternal universe, creation by self-generation or evolution, used to deny a creator, the rejection of prophecy, and the deep skepticism about religious knowledge we saw from the Samanea. Don't they sound incredibly familiar?
Disturbingly so sometimes.
So the question is, How much of what we often think of as uniquely modern thought, scientific reductionism, certain forms of atheism, the belief that empirical science is the only path to truth, is actually just a recurrence, maybe a reinvention of the very intellectual currents that Islamic theology grappled with, debated, and systematically refuted, not just dismissed, over 1,000 years ago? It makes you wonder about the real depth and relevance of these historical deep dives into human understanding, doesn't it? Something to think about.